So I'm just used to it.
You are.
So I'm Sue MacLaine.
I'm Michelle Cobbin.
And so I was asked to do Spotlight, and then we thought Michelle would be the perfect partner for me and us for each other, because we have known each other a long time. I knew, I don't know how long, but long enough.
Long time.
Michelle's been my yoga teacher for a really long time, and it was really lovely then seeing her growing into her artistic practice. And when we were, I think part of the reason that we have a sort of sensibility with each other's work is because both of us use meditation and yoga, and I use my practice as a Buddhist. I believe that that informs and underpins my work, and I think you might want to say something about that.
I'd say similar feelings around that, really, that these practices, the contemplative practices are really important for me in my life, and I bring them into the work, as I'll show you as we go along.
And when we were planning this, we had loads of ideas about how we do it like this. We'd do it in a way that would articulate the form of our work. And then we went, I tell you what, you go first and then I'll go next. It all started to get a bit complicated, but we identified 5 words that have sort of sat with us as we've thought about what we wanted to talk about today, and those are...
they are composure.
Yeah, the notion of composure and what that might mean.
Clarity.
Yeah.
Simplicity.
Yeah.
And confidence.
Yeah.
And completion.
Yeah. So we might not talk directly to those words, but when I was thinking about my practice, that those are sort of important phases of the work, not only in terms of making the work, but also in terms of how I present the work. Do you want to say a bit about what's up there?
Yeah. So we both, when we were talking, we both said that we had particular quotes that kind of resonated for us to do with our work. So mine's the John Berger one, and the Nora one is Sue's. And this is kind of sort of where we sort of started. Am I going to go into my quote now then, do you think?
I think
I should go straight into that.
Brilliant.
So for me, I mean, maybe you know this quote from Ways of Seeing. For me, as an abstract painter, I always find that whatever it is that I've thought about with the work, what it is, what it means to me, everybody else who views it will bring their own story, as you do with everything. You can't not really. But people always see different things in it, and I kind of think this quote kind of sums that up for me quite well. And it also, I think it has that sort of mindful aspect to it. The fact that you kind of, you make contact with the object of your attention, and then you relate it to yourself. So I use it in that respect for me. Is there anything like yours going on?
I can go on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll show you some images then. I'm going to start with this image, which was a, what's it called, a commission. This is a standalone image that I was commissioned to make for a yoga studio. I work as a yoga teacher. I've been doing that for nearly 2 years. 2 decades. And I'm not confident at public speaking. I'll probably get my words all over the place tonight. And I do teach at this particular studio. It's in Brighton. And what I wanted was to try and make something that I would feel comfortable with being on the wall when I went in there every week. But otherwise I had free rein to make something for the room that was a particular size. It's covering a hole in the wall, so it had to be that size. And it had to be okay with people putting their feet on it and touching it and all that kind of thing. I was influenced by the painters from the 50s in St Ives, the Patrick Heron, Hilton, those kind of painters. I like the flatness that they use in their work, and I was trying to kind of create something along those lines, but my own version of that. And I call this painting acetabulum, which is the Latin for the hip socket. And within the sort of style of yoga that I practice and this centre practices, it's all about functional movement. It's all about keeping your hips mobile. It's, you know, and I kind of wanted something that had a kind of connection of a hip in an abstract kind of form. So that's a standalone piece. And then on the whole, I work in series. So I'll make a whole set of pictures based around a theme. So this series is called The Breath. It comes again, draws on the contemplative practices, again, yoga, being mindful of the breath, in meditation. And I was considering the body as a vessel, certainly the rib cage as almost like a container for the breath. And I'd also been looking at Zen calligraphy. So the contemplative, meditative practice of making marks that they carry out in Zen calligraphy with ink on the ground with big brushes. I did a course in this and was then trying to bring that into my work in some way. So I did a whole series on calligraphy with inspired by tea ceremonies. So these are from quite a few years ago. Again, this was just when I was just starting the calligraphy practice and trying to bring it into my work. And then I did a whole series actually using ink. These are actually quite small, actually. They're only about sort of 60 centimetres wide. And then I started to then use those ideas of the making of the marks that you do with calligraphy with paint. So this painting is 1 metre square. It's called Steam. It's based on the idea of the breath and the air, really, the kind of sense of the breath inside the body. So the pan-like shape is to be like a vessel, and then there was a movement that I made with the brush just to make a big arc on and out breath. So I was trying to kind of play around with how I can incorporate breath into the paintings, into the whole action of the paintings. And I've done that again with this one. This is 2 1 metre canvases together, and I got really stuck with this. I'm trying to sort of show you sort of an earlier version of it and then a kind of a later version. So I do a lot of scraping back, taking off with these pictures and washing off. So these are oil paintings that I've run under the hose really and washed them all off to try and get a sense of movement. And this painting's called Crushed Love, and I wanted to try and get a sense of that sort of almost like the heartache and how your breath changes when you're upset and how your diaphragm gets stuck and you kind of gulp. And so there was kind of a sort of various sort of movements of kind of upwards kind of actions that I was trying to get with this, and I was painting it mostly on the ground. This is part of the same series, moving away from the calligraphy marks a bit but carrying on with the whole washing off idea, and to try and get a sense of making a lot of space on the canvas. And this is a series called Space to Breathe, and I was thinking with this, I was thinking of actually all the particles in the air and the pollution and the kind of this is actually quite a dirty looking painting in real life. It doesn't come across quite as much on the photo. It's lots of little bits all over it. And this is another one of the same series where I was trying to get a sense of not using the whole canvas. So that sense of when teaching people about breathing and asking people to take a deep breath, and they take really quite a shallow breath, quite a small breath, and wanting to take a big breath and not being able to. And I was trying to kind of sort of convey that through a set of images. So it's I've got a whole sort of set of these, trying to give you that sense of the breath kind of being sort of stuck in a particular area and yet still having some kind of sense of movement about it. That was what I was trying for anyway. This is a different series. So this goes back to the calligraphy mark making, and again really thinking about the St Ives painters and trying to get to grips for myself with what it was I really liked about their work, which was, for me, I think, was a flatness and rather than kind of like a depth and looking through something. And I wanted these kind of like quite strong, striking marks. Could I do that in paint rather than ink? Was something I was playing with. Could I get a sense of movement and stillness, which is really important for me. Within my work in general, sort of the movement and stillness seems to just come back over and over for me. And how to kind of tidy everything up and make them look simple. So that sort of sense of less is more, something I struggle with it. I kind of really want things to look really simple, and yet they can end up looking so simple that the image doesn't work. So I don't find it easy to make this type of work in particular. The little ones, that's why there's so many of them, to try and give you a sense of the scale, really. There's one at the back, they're really quite small. They took ages, and the big one actually came out really quite quickly. So for me, it's much easier for me to work on a larger scale. I've included this one, the colour's not very good, it's up here on the wall, because it was on the poster, really. That's mostly why I've included this one. In here, there's a whole different series based on kind of feelings, really, of being quite happy. The series is called Sumptuous Contentment. That sense of really being to sort of sit in your kind of sort of contentment. Really, it's a term that my therapist used with me quite a lot years ago, and saying. How I never seemed to sit in my sumptuous contentment. I always seemed to be like striving for something. And I kind of find with these large paintings, these colourful large paintings, I get a sense of almost being bathed by the colour. And I get that kind of sense of sort of quite heart-opening feeling with these bright, colourful pictures. And I made this picture because I sold this, and I was quite upset that I'd sold it once I'd sold it. It's gone to a friend's house, haven't seen it there yet. The colours haven't come out so brilliantly on this photo. This is big, it's a bit bigger than this one. And we had this up in our house for quite a long time in the bathroom, and it was a bit like getting a colour bath when you went in there, and the colours kind of fizzled, and for me I really got a sense of sort of joy from it. And initially when I was making it, the turquoise space represented my yoga mat, which is decades old and turquoise, and I can get quite stroppy if people stand on it, and so I kind of wanted to kind of almost like make a kind of a little shrine to my yoga mat. Anyway, now some of my yoga students own this. This is another large painting, again trying to be really minimal. The images on the side of the different kind of like phases it went through. So it started as a calligraphy mark making picture, which made on the ground without really any forethought, just as a kind of energetic movement, really, to try and sort of get something out there. But I couldn't make it work like that for what I wanted. And it was inspired by trips to Italy, where I was running yoga holidays and then having a holiday afterwards, and I just absolutely loved it. It was boiling hot. We'd come from freezing cold weather here, and it was just such a delight to be there. And I was looking at the ground and photographing the pavements, and it was just really boiling hot. And then inside the churches, it was kind of cool and dark, and I wanted to try and represent something that kind of conveyed both of those for me, really. So it started off as a kind of a terracotta, kind of sienna, Italian type colours, which were the colours of the place, really, and it just didn't give me that sort of feeling that I wanted. It kind of wasn't passionate enough or sensual enough somehow. So it went through quite a lot of different phases before it got to these red stages, and was shown with these coloured pieces at the bottom a few times, which represented the stained glass in the churches that I was visiting. And yet the colours really jarred with me. I'd been quite literal with those colours, and I wanted to try and mute it down really. And now it's kind of all red, and I'm happier with it. And that's just to show you those two paintings sort of as kind of for scale, really. That was at the Foundry in Lewes in a kind of the last show they had before they had to close that place. And I was lucky enough to have a show with two other women there, Jenny Shaw and, I've forgotten her name, Emily Ball, back in 2013. That's not this show, but it was a great space to be able to show work. Such a shame it's not there anymore. This is where I started to really get into the black paint. This is the finished painting. Sorry, it doesn't look especially clear to me. I sold it as soon as I showed it, actually, so I haven't got enough photos of it. Going through various stages. I don't usually compose the picture before I make it, so the process kind of happens on the canvas. It goes through often through lots of different phases. Sometimes the orientation of the canvas changes. Often the palette changes completely because it's quite mood driven, and I can kind of think, right, I'm doing a painting, I've got all the particular colours out, and then I could come back to it a week later and think, and change it completely. I waste a lot of paint like that, but I build it up. I suppose it gives me a kind of a sense of layers. This series is called Inscape. It's about sort of the interior landscape, but also about the flat landscape from East Anglia, the Fenlands, which is where I grew up, where I lived until I was 19, and where I'm happy. I don't live anymore, but I have an absolute heart calling for the place. I have a real. It's very. If you don't know it, it's very flat. You can see the horizon line most of the places. And I just get a sense of, kind of longing to be there, but it's not a true longing, because when I go there, it's not. I don't get it so much when I'm there. I think, yeah, I know why I moved away. So there's that kind of it's that nostalgic thing of kind of thinking that you love something that doesn't really exist. And I have it, I have that feeling for that place that doesn't quite exist. It's a lighter version of the same series. I also have that feeling for almost like a nostalgic feeling for a time I've never been to, like such as the 1950s with the St. Ives painters, but also with the abstract expressionists in America. I kind of have this like longing to try and, sort of find something of what it was that they created in my work. And I really grapple with this, and to try and make these kind of like simple looking, quite big paintings, often with layers, but not always. How can I kind of make that kind of thing my own, really? I don't know, sometimes I think I do it, sometimes not so successfully. This series, which is kind of like is really similar looking to that last series, but this is called Semblance as a series, and it's kind of what I was trying to sort of evoke there was how sort of when meditating, for instance, how emotions come up and you kind of sort of you let them be, you let it, you kind of explore it by just watching, really. And I wanted to kind of get a sense of like these colourful bits starting to break through as kind of almost like an emotion or sensation breaking through quite a composed, simple surface. So I've got quite a few of these. A lot of them are quite dark. Just trying to sort of show sort of something breaking through. And when I started showing these black pictures, lots of people who are used to seeing my work seemed to be quite offended. They come and sort of, what on earth are you doing? I thought your work's all about colour. And I had some interesting conversations with people who really just actually seemed quite annoyed at me for not painting these bright colours anymore. And people thinking I must be going through something really dreadful in my life. Where, you know, actually I really love black, and, you know, I was a goth when I was a teenager. You know, I kind of have a real kind of like personal connection to black. And my favourite living artist, Pierre Soulages, who's a French painter. If you don't know him, look him up. He does these amazing, very large black paintings, which are really elegant, and they're much bigger than mine. They're really huge. Anyway, this is one of the black ones. There's another one on the wall, which will be up here in a minute. This is the same kind of series, the same sort of sense of something coming through, but I kind of see this more as a sense of scars. And rather than kind of like hiding the scar, whether it's a physical scar or emotional scar, kind of allowing it to be there, let it kind of inform, you know, sort of let it be part of the character. So when I made this painting initially, obviously the red wasn't on there. It's on the surface. It's not something that's coming through, and it just really needed it. It just needed something on it to kind of give it the character. So there's a few of them that have got kind of like a red scar across them, to try, you know, it's kind of, yeah, like a wound, I guess. They just kind of happened in a way. They weren't, you know, I hadn't planned to make them like that. But I have to have this kind of dialogue with the painting. It has to resonate with me for it to be finished. I mean, I suppose that's probably the same for everyone. But I see the paintings as being kind of 3D things, really, rather than sort of portals to look through. I kind of see them as objects. I paint the sides of my canvases rather than making them a flat image. You know, I want them to be sort of almost like a thing. And this is a very large version. This was the same height as me, so I kind of felt like it was a little bit like how I might feel around a mountain, really, something that kind of can be really imposing and can kind of unsettle you a little bit, but actually really quiet. Like if it was dark, you wouldn't know it was there. I like that kind of trying to get that kind of feeling in my work. Oh, so that one shouldn't even been on there actually, because it's blurred. But I was playing with this size of canvas, which is the same size as these two paintings on the wall here, are the same size as each other. Part of the same series, just trying to get this sense of how to work with the same kind of composition and create different moods, different feelings. This one was kind of one of those happy accidents that, you know, sometimes happens in art. I was playing with lots of different mediums to put into the oil paint, and I'd mixed some various things together, and what is kind of like a white kind of stripe on the painting, that was just a surprise. That was actually dark grey, and then something happened with all the different mediums mixed together, and it kind of turned out like that, and it was much better than anything I was originally going to make, so I was delighted with that. And then I'm ending, this is my last slide, ending on this. This is a standalone piece. This was a commission, commissioned by a meditation centre in Shropshire to make a painting, and the monk who commissioned me kind of asked me a few years ago. It took me quite a long time to actually get around to making this. He wanted something that would represent the Buddha's enlightenment, and something to do with the Dharma spreading out to the world, which I just thought, right, okay. And reading up on Wikipedia around that, I mean, he's my teacher, so I kind of, he knows my work, and I kind of sort of knew what he meant. I knew I didn't have to do anything different to what I usually do, and so there were 5 colours that emanated from the Buddha at enlightenment, and this is all documented on the internet, so I've read up about that and used those to put through the centre of the picture, with one of the colours, the orange, being at the bottom to represent Theravadan Buddhism, which is the style of Buddhism that his centre's rooted in. And then the top is a mixture of all 5 colours together, which is called Prabhishwara, and they've actually got a name for those colours mixing together. And I'm using that as a kind of symbolise the Dharma going out to the world. So that's kind of that's it really. That's the Dharma going out to the world, and that's me done.
If anyone has any questions, please go ahead. I'd like to ask, so Michelle, you said about working in series.
Yeah.
What sort of number of, how many works?
How many works?
A series for you?
I don't know if I've counted them actually. One thing I'll say about that is although I move on from one series to another, sometimes when I'm making a painting, it seems to not fit the series I'm working on. It relates to a previous series, so I put it back into that series, and so I'd say they're ongoing, most of my series, and I think they probably have at least 5 in them. Some of them have probably had sort of 15 in them. Yeah.
When you've perhaps finished a series, and before you start the next one, or perhaps you have more than one series at a time, but are there like in between stages where you might either do nothing, or drawing, or printmaking, or something else?
I do have gaps in between working. I don't find that for me the sort of the inspiration or the inclination comes to work continually. I kind of feel like I work really intensely on something, and then I have a bit of a break and come back at it. And sometimes when I come back, it feels like there's more to say on what I was already doing, so I continue in that same series. And other times the painting itself just seems to sort of evolve into something else, and I have to, well, what's going on now then? This is something else. So I then try and figure out, what it is I'm making. Sometimes I make a few before I realise what the series might mean to me or what I can shape it into. I'm not a printmaker. It's something that I'm really have the intention of doing this year, is actually start doing some screen printing, because I think quite a lot of my images would work quite well as screen prints.
Translate well into printing. I was partly thinking of the artist Ian McKeever, who will, between his your works, some is similar to his, but in between his painting series, he'll either just draw or do printmaking, or perhaps go for very long walks around the world. But he doesn't consciously connect up those different series. So
I'll look him up.
Have his work.
I think those ones that are emerging, there's something that sort of is quite haunting.
These?
Yeah. They sort of look like, chisels of light pointing. I mean, do you kind of, is the colour underneath, is it kind of something you paint out, or is it something that comes forward? How do you sort of see the emerging process?
It's not the same on each picture for me, so in some ways it doesn't always feel the same. The colour is coming through, it is underneath. With most of them it is underneath, but sometimes it's not that I've completely painted over a picture. Sometimes I might paint a bit with the intention of having that piece come through. But with that one, that's got loads and loads of underpainting, because I just couldn't figure out what on earth I was doing with it, and it took quite a long time. And not just scratching at it, thinking it's not quite working, and then covering up what I thought was a really lovely piece of painting, and just having to cover it up because I couldn't make the whole thing work.
When did you do these?
This was made in 2016. It was I had a temporary let here at Phoenix. I had the MA room with Denise Harrison. We shared it one summer, and I made this in that room.
we talked about when we were planning. You were talking about sort of reflecting on the length of time that you've been an artist and where you think you might want to be going next.
Yeah.
Or what is next?
Yeah.
How,
What is next?
how might that conceive itself, not just in terms of the work, but also as you as an artist?
I've not been doing it. For me, it doesn't feel like I've been doing it that long. I've been doing it for about 10 years, 8 to 10 years, and I am interested in perhaps doing some more study in order to take me into something else. I haven't done an MA, because I'm possibly interested in doing that. At the moment, my next thing is I definitely want to do some printmaking. I want to incorporate printmaking. But at the moment, I'm not quite sure. But yes, I think having kind of come out of having a few years where I haven't really had the time to, haven't had the headspace to expand my practice very much, I'm now sort of looking for what I might do next. I'm not sure what that is yet. But something change, I think.
Hi, I love all the colours in your work and the darker pieces as well, but I was just wondering, imagining what your studio looks like, what sort of, your source material, do you find a colour somewhere and then get attached to it and try and recreate it, or do you find images elsewhere from other artists or in life, or just wondering, or does it all come from in your head?
I'd say all of those things that you mentioned actually, probably all of those things. So I get lost in the internet very easily, so I can do lots of research on the internet. I fiddle around with colours, just sort of making colours. Sometimes I'll see colour combos that I really like together, and so I might kind of like put those up. When I do that, it usually doesn't work for me though. I usually find actually that I've got to then add some other colour that's some random colour, and I ruin the original thing. Sometimes it's from photographs. Often there's an intuitive thing with the colour. It's just that I might have an idea that I want to use. With this particular picture, I wanted to paint with reds and pinks, and then the yellow came in, and it kind of all got a bit kind of too much, and then it had to be sort of painted out a bit. Often there's a lot of underpainting in my in my pictures that is very childlike, and sometimes I've got two brushes and I'm really going at the canvas and just kind of, it's quite scribbly and messy, and it takes, I need to get that side of things out, out of me, and then I kind of do the tidying up and the paring down and taking out as much as I can in order, just until I can sit with it, until it sort of almost like takes on a life of its own for me.
Do you think your work is more or less successful when you're working on commission pieces?
It's different actually. Having the piece I showed you right at the beginning, I mean that just took me ages to make that. I mean, partly it was the first commission I ever had. I knew I was going to end up seeing it a lot, so I mean I gave myself a bit of a hard time over it because of that. Whereas sometimes you make a commission, you never ever see it once it's left your studio, But I knew that wasn't going to be the case with that one, so that took ages. It took me months to make that because I just kept painting over it again because it wasn't right. But the last one, I think with the picture I finished with, although I made that fairly quickly, I've been going over it in my head for several years because I knew I was going to have to make it at some point. So I don't know that I find it easier. It's different. I like it. I like working with commissions. I like the constraint.
Do you think, Michelle, in your work, as you said that you often scrape it back and you often play around for a long time and leave it and come back, and then sometimes you said that you use calligraphic marks. Do you think there's a relationship between the way you're working and, for example, the way you give a yoga class, in that you take a series of events and you merge them, and then you reject some and you accept others, and then you, in some respects, finish the work on some sort of clear line, some settled place. Is there a parallel there?
Are you seeing a parallel as a?
Well,
as
I'm
a,
asking.
as a,
Possibly I do. Yes. Sometimes.
You've been in my yoga classes. Maybe, yeah. I mean, I certainly find that there is a kind of connection between the different things I do. I think partly why I like working big is so I can move as I'm doing that, as I'm painting, but also the kind of covering it all up, making it look still, I think reflects to the with yoga. The not being very I don't know, I was going to say not so well planned. I mean, the thing with my yoga classes, they're not scripted, but I kind of know where they're going to go, whereas I think with the paintings I don't know where they're going to go. I don't even know that I know where I want them to go. So I'm not sure, not completely sure. Yes, right at the back.
When do you know it's finished? Do you know when the painting is done and you're ready to come back to it?
I think it's more just how I feel about it. Sometimes I kind of think something's finished, and then as I view it over time, if I end up kind of it not resonating with me, then I'll change it at some point. It goes in the cupboard or into the pile of ones that need to be altered. So I kind of feel as if they kind of almost come to life for me when they're finished. They stop being a kind of a 2D thing, and they become a thing instead of something I'm making.
Michelle, your relationship to paint, do you ever feel drawn to making something representational? Or because in a way some of them are very much like landscape.
Yeah.
And there was one where you were talking about living in East Anglia.
Yeah.
And there's one with a kind of ditch.
Yeah.
Which I thought was amazing. I mean, I'm very excited by the rest of your paintings, but that one really fascinated me, and I thought it was really wonderful. But do you ever feel drawn to something representational? I mean, it certainly doesn't look like you are. I'm just interested.
I think.
Or do you see these as representation in any way?
I mean, I can read into. I mean, the ditches that are, that are very obvious in East Anglia, and certainly when you're driving on this road and there's this huge ditches either side. That there was a sense of that I have a series of pictures like that with these dips. So representational, a little bit, sort of a kind of a nod towards representational, but I'm not so interested in making representational things, really. The tea series I made was probably as representational as I want to get, and I feel like I want to move away from that, really. I want to have as little in the picture as I possibly can and still find it interesting. At the moment, anyway.
Well, it's a really good time to stop, I think. And, thanks ever so much, Michelle.
So there's a table there, which I should have said before, which has got various things about my work, published scripts, but also it's got notebooks of two of the pieces of work that I'm going to talk about tonight. One piece called Can I Start Again Please, and another piece called Vessel. And they're there if anybody fancies having a nose through them. Because when I write something, I should say, so I would describe myself mostly as a writer, but I create performance work. And again, I find language and how to talk about what it is that I do, because I don't think I write plays. I don't really write a well-made play. I think I make, I'm sort of contemporary performance, live art, performance art, along that continuum, and there's lots of different definitions of what those things are. The last piece that I made, which I'll talk about probably last, which was called Vessel, which opened last year in October, is probably the most conceptual piece that I've made to date. I think Michelle and I have a lot of similarities in our process of working, because I tend to follow quite a sort of academic approach, in that I read above the subject that I'm interested in, then I read around it, and then I read specifically to it. And it takes me a long time before I actually write the piece. I might, however, come up with a page or a paragraph, and I know that that is going to stay in the work. But I tend to stay away from actually my fingers on the keyboards for a really long time. And I write, but everything that is going to be in the piece is in the notebooks or is in the folders. And so I have I have an approach where at the end of each week I will go through all of my research, all the things that I've written about, and I will pull across what I'm going to take into the following week. I'll dismiss stuff, I'll categorise it, I'll rework it. So I'm quite I'm quite sort of thorough in that way. But I'm also, this isn't art by the way, it's just my terrible desktop, which I realise I'm just showing my pants to you all. So I go between being incredibly thorough, reading a lot, thinking a lot, and then napping. And I don't say that lightly. I use sleep as a huge tool in my artistic process, where I'll think intensely and then I'll go to sleep for anywhere between half an hour and 2 hours. And I am a strong believer that during that time of napping, something goes on in my head. There's a sort of palate cleanser. And I do quite a lot of my writing in bed as well. I find that containment of being in a bed, or thinking in the bath, or on journeys where there's a sort of beginning and end. I find those boundaries really incredibly helpful. So the things that really interest me about writing, that I'm interested in writing, is to do with memory and to do with how we compose ourselves and how we psychologically compose ourselves. So there's those two meanings of composure, which is how do I compose the text or the piece of work, but also how do I compose myself in relationship to that work. And because I'm often in the work that I write, what sort of performance, persona or composure do I want to have? So I'm currently doing a PhD. I just started a PhD at the University of Essex, which is about the subject of female-authored performance work, female-authored solo performance that's autobiographical at source. And I wanted to just show this quote. There's a writer called Annie Ernaux who wrote a book called The Years. And this is her talking about her work. And it really sort of sums up the things that I'm interested in. So is that readable for you? No. So I'll read it out. So somebody asks her, in an essay you wrote about Journal du Dehors, you said that it was an attempt to write in a je transpersonal. What does that mean? And Annie Ernaux says, what I mean by that is everything that could be opposed to the autobiographical je. In the je, as I conceive of it, it's not an identity that aligns with me and my history. It's not a psychological je. It's a je that is marked by the communal experiences which many of us have known. The death of one's parents, the condition of women, illegal abortion. The epitome of this je transpersonal is The Years, which is her book, where the je completely disappears. For me, the je is not an identity, but a place marked by human experiences and human events. That is what I try to illuminate through my writing. I say je transpersonal because it is not the individual or the anecdotic that interests me, but that which is shared, whether that be social or even slightly in the order of the psychological, in the realm of reaction. That is how I may be sure that I am bringing to light something that isn't reducible to a personal history. Essentially, I want to put myself at a distance, the greatest distance between what I've lived, who I am. It's about being able to distance yourself. It's an attitude, of course, and it took time to construct my earliest books. La la la. So I'm really interested in that. So a lot of my works starts from a sort of autobiographical impulse, which is either something that is compelling me. So the first, I'm going to show you some video clips, which are mainly sort of, what you call them, promos of shows. So there's 3 shows that have got videos and another one that I'll talk about. And this first one that I'm going to show you is it's created around a character called Sid Lester, who's an old man who used to be a vaudeville performer, or did he? And I play a lot with this idea of that the audience clearly know that it's me and that I'm a man, but everybody believes utterly in Sid Lester. And he has a career that ranges from working with Buster Keaton through to being on X Factor. And it's impossible that all of that is true. But he talks about it all as if it's true. And has all these anecdotes. And he is sort of believable. But he's also an incredible bully. And he has a relationship with his daughter Valerie, who he abuses really powerfully through the whole of the shows. And so the starting impulse for that was my family, and there's a piece that I'll talk about later on, Can I Start Again Please, which was the most sort of autobiographical that I've written. But the starting point for Sid was that one day there was 2 things that happened. I read an article which was about a cookery class for widowed men was being closed down. And these men were talking about how they didn't know how to cook and their wives had died and what a lifeline this cookery course was. So I started to think about that, the loneliness of older men. And then I just started thinking about my own loneliness, which at that time was incredibly profound. And so I think in the same way as Michelle was talking about, I sort of sit with feelings, my feelings about things for quite a long time. And again, Buddhism, being meditating, a lot of therapy, years of therapy, and this idea of this sort of third space that can happen in therapy, in yoga, in meditation, where you somehow transcend the self. And that through that transcendence, and sitting with pain and distress and uncomfortable feelings, not that I want to particularly put myself there just to make art, but it feels always important that I'm in conversation with those things. Anyway, I'll introduce you to Sid. So there's a show that we do called the Sid Lester Christmas Special, where Sid sort of runs through it and I pull in. We have Elf, you'll see, is with us this evening, and various other performers. So before we all start singing along. So Sid came about when I did an MA. It was really, I did an MA at the University of Sussex in life history and life writing, which started to look at How do people construct their stories? How do people construct their memories? How do we compose ourselves to the world? How do we want to present ourselves? And looking at those ideas of that a story we might tell about ourselves when we're 20 might be completely different when we're 50. And do we always want to put ourselves into a good light? So after that, the next show I made was sort of biography in a way. I made a piece called Still Life, an audience with Henrietta Moraes, which actually premiered and opened here. And that was about an artist called Henrietta Moraes, an artist model called Henrietta Moraes, who was a model and muse for Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon. He painted her 21 times. It was a triptych of her face. And I read about her after she died, and in her obituary, she said she gave her profession as bohemian. And I just thought, who is this amazing woman, and started to read about her. And she wrote an autobiography, and she was a really rackety old thing, and drinking, drugs, sort of was described as the Queen of Soho. And in her autobiography, she'd lost her children into care because she was a heroin addict. And in her autobiography, she gave over about 2 chapters to talking about her dogs, and she gave over about 3 lines to talking about her children. And she sort of said, I was in a terrible mess, and they had to be taken away, and there was a very nice lady who took them somewhere, And I thought how fascinating it was, that about how she chose to sort of construct herself. And she, at the point where she'd finished writing the autobiography, she'd stopped drinking because she'd been diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver. And then she met with Maggie Hamlin, who they became lovers. And Maggie started painting her again, and Henrietta went back to drinking, which I don't think was to do with Maggie, but she just went back to drinking. And then when she died, Maggie Hamlin did a whole series of paintings of her after she died, part of her series of work. And so I made this work where I constructed the performance as a life drawing class. And so I was performing as Henrietta. I was pretty much from the beginning of the piece naked throughout the piece, so I was always in pose during the piece. And I was either in pose while I was talking, or I stopped and did timed poses where I recreated some of the performances, some of the poses that Henrietta did. And it was a really fascinating and brilliant, and really you're never going to be frightened of anything ever again after doing that show, because I did it in normal lighting, in just either daylight or studio lighting, and so it was fascinating because some people came and were theatre people, not artists. Some people came who were artists and not so much theatre. And it was a really interesting thing because I had control of the room. I timed the poses. So quite often when I stopped the poses, people who were drawing me would tut. People would tut and get annoyed. There's a real etiquette around life drawing, which I hadn't understood. And then at one point I'd go out into the audience and I'd look at what people have drawn. And that was a really interesting thing, because some people were sort of quite proud and showed me their drawings, and then other people sort of very surreptitiously turned them over. Just lots of different reactions. But we made a script of it afterwards, and so this is from some of the drawings that came out of the piece with the text. And again, the text was not it wasn't about writing a chronological autobiography. It was sort of like a long poem, which quite a lot of my work is. And if you want, afterwards, there's some drawings. One person who came did some ink drawings during the piece and wrote quotes from the script during it, and she sent me them afterwards. So there's some really lovely drawings. So that was in, I think we did it here. I think it opened, it was 2012, I think, and we did it, I did it in this room. No, next door. Did it next door, and I did it over 4 weekends and 5 performances over each weekend. And at the end of each performance, we collected up people's drawings and did an exhibition out in that corridor, which was really a beautiful thing. So I'm aware that I'm running out of time. So this next piece I made was then called Can I Start Again, Please? And I'll show you the trailer. I'll do it that way around.
There are so many possibilities.
Okay. So Can I Start Again, Please was quite an important piece for me. The subject matter of it was around what capacities language has to represent traumatic experience, and it drew on my experience of sexual violence when I was a child within my family. And what I wanted to do was not make an autobiographical piece that said this happened to me, this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened, and that happened. And so in this reading around, this reading above, of knowing the emotional heart of a piece and then putting that in a corner and then going as far away from it as possible and then seeing how I can marry it back. And I often find a philosopher or a particular text, and in this case it was Wittgenstein, who wrote that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And that seemed to be a really seminal and important thing to find. And so the piece was Nadia, who's my co-performer there, is a native sign language user. She's a deaf woman. I'm fluent in sign language, having worked as a sign language interpreter for the last 22 years. And so to put these two languages together of English and sign language and how they clash and collide elaborated something about the content of the piece. So I'm always trying to find ways that the form can say something about the content. And that show, just in terms of a trajectory for me, having opportunities, I took it to the Edinburgh Festival, it did well. And that it was a good thing to happen in terms of my ability to carry on working. And it was when I was making and working on Can I Start Again, Please, I started working with Jane McMorrow, who some of you know from being the chair here, and she became the executive producer of Can I Start Again, Please, and in 2015, we've worked together for the last 4 years, coming up to 4 years, and Jane then produced the next piece, which is called Vessel, and I'll show you that. Again, this is a promo. So Vessel was a sort of a follow-on from Can I Start Again, Please, in a way, but in other ways it wasn't. And the starting point of it was this practice of anchoritism, which was a practice that happened between 12th and 15th century, where men and women, but mostly women, would go into a cell which was built within a church or attached to a church. And then they lived there for the rest of their lives, and they became anchors of the faith. There were 3 squints within the cell, one looking out into the world. So the cells were often built on pilgrim paths, another one looking into the church so that they could still take part in Mass, and the other one was for what they called necessaries, so they often had a maid who would, it was sort of food and feces exchange, you know, putting it unpoetically. And so coming out of writing a piece that was about trauma, I was really interested then in writing about a piece about how you just stay with stuff. How do you stay with your life? And anchoritism seemed to be a perfect sort of example of that, about how did those women live in those cells. And I read this thing which said anchorite, so at its height there was about 800 anchorite cells across England. There's one still, the remnants of it, in a church in Lewes called St Anne's, if you want to go and look at it. It said anchorites are joined in an imaginary community, although each follows their path in isolation. And I found that a really interesting thing. So Vessel became this piece which was about about the personal and the political, I suppose. And it used a recurring theme of let's talk about. And so the actors, in the same way as in Can I Start Again Please, work with a score, and that seems to be an important part of my work, that people understand that it's not pretend. You can see that, you know, this is the script. You can see actors working with it. So this is so Vessel opened last year, and then it's sort of on hold, but we'll probably come back at the beginning of when Jane, in August. August, yeah. Okay, so Vessel was interesting because it was the most, it's like I said, it's the most sort of probably conceptual piece in some ways, and it got very mixed critical responses to it. And one of the reviews of it, which was particularly harsh, said something in a quite a sneery way, which said, blah blah blah, is this theatre, and maybe Vessel should be entered for the Turner Prize. As if that was a fucking bad thing. As if I'm supposed to be offended by that. But there was real confusion about whether this was theatre or not. And on that note, I wanted to leave you with, there was an agent called Peggy Ramsey, who was a very famous agent, and she wrote this letter to David Hare, after a piece of his called Knuckles was terribly reviewed. And for those who can't, I'm happy to read it. Fuck the critics. They've all compromised or sold out. They are failures. And along comes a shining child of 26 and tells them what's wrong with them. They aren't big enough to take the blows. Are you really going to allow these grey, shabby lot to break your spirit and your confidence? Everyone has knocks. Ibsen was a disaster for years. So was Chekhov. But more and more people began understanding their work and demanding them. Have you read Ibsen's life? You'd better do so, because you can see that fame of his sort required years of accepted suffering. All that matters is your work. No, not absolutely all, because you mustn't treat yourself as a person so harshly. It's all inverted conceit in an odd sort of way. Look outward, dear child. Don't muck about picking at your entrails and shitting on yourself. Your work is more important than you are, because it's what everybody can actually hear and see. You have great talent and are mucking about by trying to destroy your nerve. The only way you will get to failure is to deliberately bring it on yourself. So that, I wanted to finish on that, because I am I have Jane and Mark is also here who support me, and there's people in the audience who have worked with me, but ultimately it's totally me selling ideas, raising funding. As we all know, everyone does the same version of that. And, you know, Can I Start Again Please was incredibly well reviewed, and Vessel was really not very well reviewed at all. And, you know, that was really, it's really something to read people saying terrible things about you and how you just, you know, how you find that resilience. And I know that I will keep on making work regardless of what other people say, but at the time it is incredibly wounding because you're also always trying to understand who you are as an artist. So I really like that. And I like the fact that it also says, it's, you know, when you get upset about it, it's your own ego is in place. You know, get over yourself, sort of thing. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sue, for a fascinating talk.
Good.
And you as well, Michelle, the way they overlap. There's some really interesting third spaces.
I'm going to pull this out because then it's otherwise it's so maybe somebody could put the light on.
Put the light on. Any questions?
Whoa! Disco!
Hang on. Yeah, what's that? Any questions?
I'm really interested in your naps.
Yes.
Because I rather like naps as well in that same sort of way.
Very
But it's, I often find it's the difference between clearing and bubbling up.
Yes.
And is it both for you?
It is both. I mean, they do have very different feelings. So a nap sometimes can be a sort of palate cleanser. It's like when everything sort of drops down and drops away. And that can be partly to do with that I just get like that and I don't know what I'm doing. It's partly because that can then make me really sad as a person. Do you know what I mean? That I can get really hard on myself and very like, what the fuck are you doing? What are you doing? And I don't know how it is.
You know, do that a lot to ourselves in dreams.
We do a lot, yes, but my dreams are often quite comforting and sort of putting things in boxes. I do a lot of showing my work and sharing my work from very early on. I invite people in to come and see it or hear about it or read some of it. And so sometimes you can, what I can have written by myself, you put it up on its feet in front of other people or have someone else reading it, and all of a sudden it falls completely into tatters. And usually after those sorts of sessions, the only thing to do is go and have a big sleep, you know, because it's just too much to face what might have to come. But I also do think that if you look at something, if I go away from it and then I come back to it after a nap, it solves itself. Or I'm a nap, or I can let it go.
Absolutely.
Or I can chuck it. You know.
So the other side of that is, of course, with the bubbling up, do you get sort of times when you've like a whole thing is evolved in your head?
Yeah, pretty much.
And then it sort of goes, and you feel like sort of.
No, I'm sort of the other.
Can you remember?
No, the sort of confusion is before I start writing. But like with Can I Start Again Please, I thought about it a lot, and then I wrote what was the first 6 pages, like boom. So I was in rehearsal, so it's good to have got something done because there were people. And I went home after a particularly grueling day and I had a nap, and then I woke up and then I drank a bottle of white wine, and then I fell asleep again, and then I woke up at about 4 o'clock and then I wrote the first 6 pages. And it was like that. And then they were, so that, the thing that's in the promo of Nothing Bad Will Happen Here, that had come before those 6 pages, and I knew that was some sort of rock, that was some sort of rock. But those, and the same with Henrietta with Still Life. Thought about it a lot. Lisa, who's here, heard the first version of it, which was a lot longer, but it was sort of not that much different, was it? I mean, it was sort of different, but not that much different. So I tend to hold, like holding my breath for a really long time, and then once I go, I go.
I'm curious about what artists you look at in your studio, like mentors or who you turn to.
Yes.
And if they're on the sort of on that range you were talking about of writers and performance artists and I suppose even plastic artists. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just went to. So there's. I really like Andrew Wyeth's work, and I don't know why, but I really love his work. And I went to Barcelona last week, and Michelle had suggested I went to the Tapies Foundation, and I walked in and I burst into tears. I just burst into tears, and I feel this strong vibration with the visual arts. I mean, even though I'm a writer first and foremost, I think that I write choreographically and I write visually as well, in terms of that. And so during sometimes it's music that might be the thing that needs to hold me, but often if I'm in deep writing, then going to look at art is the most, to not have words. And I just started, Denise, I don't know if Denise Harrison's in here, but I've started doing the acrylics course here because it's just fucking brilliant. I mean, you just don't, and not that you don't think, but it's exhausting, but there's no words to it.
I'm interested in, what struck me was with the music and the movement, there's this mesmerising quality which takes you to a kind of zone, which is not dissimilar to what Michelle was describing, that kind of third space or non-space. And I just wondered if that was something you sort of connected on in relation to your pairing.
It was, I think, because I'd seen all of Michelle's work and Michelle's seen all of my work, and I suppose that sense of spaciousness that there is, and this idea, in the same way as Michelle was talking about layering and doing the sort of crazy kid version, and then layering and layering, is what I do with drafts of pieces in the same way. And I'm always looking to, if I had to describe my work, I would say it's sort of essentialist, rather than minimalist. It's like what really needs to be here to tell this story. And so I think I see that in Michelle's work, and that's why, like the Tapies and non-iconic, non-representation, although Andrew Wyeth is hugely representational, so that's a big lie. But I don't know, there's something, that just allows you to do this, go here, and I think when I write, I try and think of it like an eclipse, that you just don't look at it too quickly, and don't look directly at it. I horse whisper my pieces into life, I blow into their nostrils until they win it. I feel that maybe is a visual art sensibility of can you know,
in a visceral sense.
You can know and not know, and living with that tension. It's torture, but I really like it.
Could you say something about the music?
So in Vessel, that was specially composed by a young man called Owen Crouch, who's a sound designer. And I always start. So Vessel was the first real collaborative, where I had a sound designer and a costume designer and a lighting designer and a set designer. So it was how do you brief or how do you involve those people, you know, and what do you give them. And so with Owen, I started off with William Basinski, which is the disintegration loops, and some sort of hallucinogenic 70s and 80s music that I'd listened to. And I had this idea about, the same with the choreography in the piece, I sort of had this idea that I knew I wanted it to come at the end. And I knew that I wanted in Vessel to be this feeling of containment, 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 and then right at the point where it couldn't be contained anymore, it was allowed, only very, very briefly, to burst. And you sort of got a little bit of that. In Can I Start Again Please, the promo, there actually wasn't any sound in the performance piece. But in terms of creating a trailer to sell it to audience, to bookers and so on, we put the, what's it called, the something veil tabernacle. It's the John Tabernacle.
Oh, yes,
protecting veil. It was the protecting veil. So it's interesting because Vessel, which is my last piece, is the first piece that's had the most theatrical artifice in it. So does that answer your question?
Are you in Vessel? I couldn't work out.
I'm not. I haven't been.
Yeah,
Because I'm going to be in it, because I wrote it and directed it, and because there was a team, you know, it ended up being a team of 12 with 4 actors and other designers that I couldn't go in it.
So how did that?
It was torture.
Yeah, well, it's performing. Maybe a stupid question, but is it an important part of it for you?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I think as artists, you can be an artist and no one ever sees your work.
Yes.
And if you're performing, you can lead an
Yes.
audience, don't you? I mean,
Well, it's an interesting thing, and partly my PhD is looking at ideas about what needs to be attributable, about notions of attribution and being attributable back. So, you know, with Can I Start Again Please, I was very attributable. It was clearly my story, I wrote it, I performed in it, and so this is my sort of PhD talking, but I'm sort of positing the notion that one of the reasons it was successful was because I was a living artifact of a traumatic story, which is quite popular nowadays. And I wasn't in Vessel, so it wasn't attributable back, and it's a very political piece, and it takes on racism and capitalism and the patriarchy. And I think one of the reasons that it got slammed was because people couldn't find a way into it because I wasn't in it, and so they didn't know where to attribute these ideas. And for me as a writer, I learn a lot about what I've written by performing it and having that interaction with the audience, and so I was cut off from that, which I don't think was helpful.
I'm just wondering whether there's a performance art and a visual art collaboration on the horizon between you, because it seems like you have a really good connection and a lot in common. And
thank you for suggesting it. Yes. Yeah.
We'd like to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Look forward to it.
Any other questions?
Yes, so I'm wondering whether you surprise yourself about the work and the format of the product that you make. I mean, particularly, you know, at the end you're talking about the last piece wasn't received as well as you would have hoped.
Anyone
but
would have hoped.
But the point is, you know, an artist makes the work that they've got to make.
Yes.
If you're honest, you've just got to go with it, even sometimes whether you are uncomfortable with it, you don't always like it.
No.
And I just wondered whether
I think
it's
it
a
does.
struggle sometimes
Yeah,
to
I
actually
mean,
make the work that you do.
yeah, I think there's lots of different factors, you know. And also I should say that, you know, audiences' responses to Vessel was very different to critical response. So that was helpful. So I think there's a couple of things for me. There's one that it's the fact that I am who I am and that I'm now doing a PhD and that I'm making this sort of work is an extraordinary thing. Because I come from Brighton, from a working class. I left school at 16 without any qualifications. And so a lot of my perspectives on the world are from that upbringing, not just because it was traumatic, but also because it was working class and because my parents wanted me to join the Wrens, you know. And so everything is a surprise in terms of how I've manifested myself in the world. And that still takes some coming to terms with. And I suppose that's about the critic thing, about how do you maintain your confidence or your sense of identity, and how do you build your own privilege, and maintain that privilege and maintain that capital, that social capital, that cultural capital, to ensure that people keep on being interested in you, or talking about your work in a way that makes people interested in you. And so Vessel was a big surprise in where it went, because it just went like that. And, you know, having Jane working with me as producer and finding collaborators, and it's a really interesting, it's maybe a much less private relationship than visual artists, because I am answerable to, not answerable, but I'm in conversation with, you know, I made some artistic decisions that Jane then had to fund, you know, and she's laughing now. But, you know, so finding that way of meeting your own artistic vision, but also that not fucking everybody else up, is also another fault line in my work.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for...
I just wanted to say that I do think, Sue, you are doing yourself a little bit of a disservice about Vessel. Absolutely. Not only yourself, but also the piece itself, because it was incredible. Mm-hmm. And the audience response, as you say to it, was phenomenal. People just were blown away by it. And actually, those reviewers who came and understood, and took the time to understand, also wrote some amazing reviews. And it was very frustrating for those reviewers who came that hadn't taken the time to understand the piece of work. So therefore that means it's not good. And so, you know, I just wanted to clarify that. And also to say that it is going to have a new life in August, and the reason that it's having a new life is because it's been recognised for what it is. So,
you can say something about how it's been recognised. Is that not okay?
Yeah, sure, we're not allowed to say.
So it's got a nice opportunity, which I'm not allowed to say because it's going to be announced in April. But it's got a nice opportunity. But it was a wounding experience.
On many levels.
On many levels. And that's just an interesting place to fucking sit, you know. But we survived.
Thank you, Jane, for that.
Thank you, Jane.
And thank you both for an absolutely fascinating